Today, we're pleased to have with us Travis Henline. He is the new site manager of West Virginia Independence Hall, most of you know him. And he was previously an interpretive park ranger for the National Park Service at Fort Necessity National Battlefield. He also worked as an interpretive historian at Pretzels and was the manager of public history development for Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, where he coordinated their American Indian initiative. He has also lectured on Native American studies at WVU. He is here today to tell us give us an overview of the histories and cultures of the Eastern Woodland Native American peoples. Here he is, Travis Henline.
I'm going to walk out here because I can't stand impediments. So I'd like to be out here with you. Shio nagana. Ayo dazan so stalanus agado. Aya yona galegi no leg Travis Henline dagaloha. Ilo Zadenzo Tagami Aliezi Shi. Wheeling, West Virginia, Watini Dei. Yo Mashki. Native American Studies, West Virginia University. So hello everyone, how are you? My name is Travis. It's good to see you, thank you for coming. I live here in Wheeling and I teach Native American Studies at WVU. The language was Cherokee. Why is it that I'm speaking Cherokee and why is it that I'm here before you to speak about Indians? Well, the language I learned when I was working in Colonial Williamsburg as coordinator of their Indian initiative, and I was working very closely with the Eastern Band Cherokee in North Carolina. And we were doing a lot of different projects, one of which you'll see here at the end. And I needed language to participate in those programs because I was to be the interpreter, the cultural go-between to these situations. And so the Eastern Band Cherokee, through their museum, the Museum of the Cherokee Indian, they actually teach a Cherokee language course, and it's an immersive course, which means for 10 days, you do nothing but speak the Cherokee language, and it is immersive, meaning you cannot speak English. My teacher, my Didio Hashki, if you try to speak in English, he would say blah, 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 Zalagigante, use Cherokee. And so that's where I initially picked up the language. I've used it in other respects. I taught a one-credit course at WVU, Intro to Cherokee Language, even though I myself am not Cherokee. And so why am I here to talk to you today? Well, a lot of it starts with family. For me, we have Native ancestry in our family. I'm a native West Virginian from the central part of the state. Like many West Virginians, our family has Native ancestry. I was the first in the family to care about that. And when I got into college, I pursued the knowledge of that. And long story short, we're here talking today. So that's where it begins with me. My big thing has been teaching Indian subjects to public audiences. And that's why I've worked for the National Park Service and Frigates Ford and historic sites and museums, because I enjoy classroom teaching, but I much prefer to talk to y'all. I like to talk to the public because I have found two things when it comes to American Indians and the general public. One, there is a profound ignorance among most people when it comes to American Indian peoples. But number two, there's a great willingness to learn. Look around you. The room is full today. So there is evidence of that. People want to know. This is something they were not told about. This is something you don't learn about in school. I went through the West Virginia public education system, and I didn't learn squat about Indians other than they killed Custer. Okay? And if you go back and review the textbooks from when I was a kid, and my son's in the 4th grade this year, so I'm ready to check them out. But my textbooks said a couple things about West Virginia Indians. It said that no Indians really lived in West Virginia, that they just passed through. This was a hunting ground. They weren't really here. Okay, so maybe one of the first things let's start off with today is that is absolutely false. That Indians have always lived in West Virginia, and that Indians still live in West Virginia. And in fact, we live in a very important place here in the Upper Ohio Valley. But I'll get to that in a minute. Some of you have seen me do this talk before, so I'm going to try not to be too redundant. I want to talk a little bit more about cultural things today. The two previous talks I did were more about political history, not as much social history. Okay? So that's what we'll talk about again today. So let's start from the beginning. Let's start a little bit about terminology. Okay? A lot of people are confused about terminology. Are they Indians? Are they Native Americans? Are they indigenous peoples? Are they first peoples? Are they aboriginal? Okay? It depends. That's the answer. The term Native American is a relatively new term. American Indian has been used for generations, for centuries. In fact, this Monday is what? Columbus Day. And we can thank him for that term, because when he landed in the Caribbean, the people in the place that he thought he was in, he thought he was in the West Indies. So he called these people Indians. And that's why it is stuck to this day. Although I have read one author who argues that when he saw the native people in their natural state, that is, not a lot of clothes, living close to the earth, he called them Indios, which in Spanish means of God. I have heard that before. But anyway, Columbus is where we get the term Indians. Here's the safest bet. Call them what they are. They're not Indians, they're Cherokees and Shawnees, they're Creeks, they're Senecas, they're Catawbas, Lakotas, they're all these things. That's the safest way with your terminology. I don't get too caught up into it. Some people do. And I'm here to tell you, those people who get very vehement about terminology, who get worked up and angry about terminology, pay attention to those folks, because usually those folks have an agenda. Okay, so I don't worry too much about terminology. One more thing about terminology and names. The names that we know Native people by are usually not necessarily the names they have for themselves. We call the Cherokee people Cherokee, but they call themselves Aniwumiya, which means the principal people. We call the folks out in the Southwest, we call them Navajos. They don't call themselves Navajos, they call themselves Diné, which means the people. The Iroquois people don't call themselves Iroquois. They call themselves Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. Okay? And when you look at all these names that Native people have for themselves, generally they translate into the people or the principal people, or like Chickahominy, or the ground corn people. Okay? So that's the first thing about terminology. I have to do a quick review for some of you. Some of you have heard this talk before. Some of you have not. So we have a little bit of a learning curve. So let's talk a little bit with origins. Most Native people, all Native people, have an origin story. They have a story of where they come from. Okay, just like Genesis. And it's usually associated with a physical place. Okay, and there are two motifs to origin stories in Native peoples. One is descent from above. You think of the Iroquois story of Sky Woman. Sky Woman falls from above to the earth. Others are of emergence. That is, they are below and they come up into this world. The Navajo people say this is the beginning of the fifth world, the Hopi and the Navajo, that they've come up through these four worlds. The Choctaw people can take you to a mound in the southeast and say, that mound is where we came into this world. Okay? So Native people have their own origin stories. Okay? And when you talk to Native people, they will say, we have been here forever. Forever. When you talk to scientists, the anthropologists, archaeologists, they will say different things now. But what they used to say was only one thing. It was only one explanation for how Indians came to be here in the Americas. It was called the Bering Strait theory. Some of you know it very well. If you don't know it, 12,000 years ago, we had an ice age. The water level dropped. There was this hypothetical land bridge that appeared between Alaska and Siberia, and all the Indians ran across. Okay? And for this theory to work, because people have picked it apart, there had to be an ice-free corridor through central Canada. So they came across and they had a convenient ice-free corridor. And they made their way down and the first person to touch the tip of Tierra del Fuego won. So they took off running. Okay? That's the old explanation. That was the end-all, be-all explanation for the people in the Americas. And I'm here to tell you, the scholarship has shown that, well, it's time to revise that outlook. Now there's the Pacific Rim theory. Hey, maybe they used boats. Read one author who said, well, where's the evidence? Well, aren't boats made of stuff like wood, okay, and sinew, and okay, so that stuff would probably would deteriorate. So 12,000 years later, I'm surprised we haven't found any evidence of boats. Other theories that Polynesians came across, we know that the Polynesians were out floating around in the ocean a long time ago, and they have found Polynesian-associated artifacts on islands off of the coast of Southern California. Okay, so maybe they're coming across that way. There's all sorts of other theories. Thor Heyerdahl, you remember the Kon-Tiki expedition years ago, he sailed a balsa raft from South America, Polynesia, to prove people could do it. And then he went over to Egypt, made a reed raft, and sailed it across the Atlantic to South America to prove that people could do it. And probably worked. The Olmecs, one of the oldest civilizations in Central America, one of the earliest. We don't know much about them except what they left physically. And what they left were some of these big, humongous statues, heads. But these heads and these statues have what they call Negroid features or African features. So were Africans coming over here very early? Here's the bottom line about origins. The new scholarship is starting to show that what we call Indian peoples, what Christopher Columbus called Indians on his first contact, these are different people who came from different places at different times. Different people, different places, different times. And the linguistics are also offering a clue. Linguists are looking at languages because you can trace people's movements by their language and their language change over time. And so a lot of linguists are looking at some of these North American languages. For example, let's take the Iroquoian language. Cherokee is also part of the Iroquoian language family. And they say, well, these come from the south, not from the north. These must have come up into North America instead of from the north down. So there's a lot of new scholarship, a lot of exciting scholarship out there about Indian origins. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit. I told you you lived in a very special place. The Upper Ohio Valley was a very special place thousands of years ago. When you consider mounds and mound building, you all know that right down the road we've got the biggest conical mound east of the Mississippi, which apparently was built on a weekend trip when people were passing through West Virginia. When you look at all that, the Upper Ohio Valley was the epicenter. It was the beginning of the mound building cultural trade. It started here first, folks, and it was spread out. Over time, we would call this culture Adena, and the later, more elaborate culture that followed the Hopewell. These are our names for them. We don't know what they call themselves. This was a cultural practice that was shared over many groups. Many diverse ethnic groups built mounds. They built them slightly differently. The early mounds were mostly for burials, like Great Creek was a burial mound. Some of them were built for astronomical observation, like the newer earthworks over in Ohio. Later on, during what we call the Mississippian period, these mounds would later be built for structures to be placed on top, usually council houses, prominent people, priestly elites, stratified societies during the Mississippian period. They put their houses on mounds. But that spread out, folks. That went all the way down to the southeast. I've been to Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, and right in their town they have mounds that were built there thousands of years ago. Okay, so the practice of mound building spread out far and wide. It became pretty ubiquitous in Eastern America, but it started here first. This is its epicenter. This is its origin. That's why you live in a special place. Okay? This is all by way of review. I'm going to get us up to the cultural stuff. Now, first contact occurs. Here is one of the most important things you need to understand about early American Indian European interactions. Everything is going to change before first settlements are even made in the Americas. Here's why. Early on, you have explorers coming into the coastal areas. You have fishermen coming across. You have traders who are coming across and trading early goods with the coastal peoples. Those people trade those goods further inland with other groups. Well, here's the problem. With all these people and all these things come microbes. European diseases. Talking about smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis. Later on, when we begin to import African slave, malaria also comes into play. These European diseases, the native people had no immunity. They had never been exposed to these things before. And so it had a devastating effect. And when I tell you there's a before and after an Indian country, this is it. This is the big one. There was what was before and what was after. European diseases killed millions, I'm not exaggerating, millions of native peoples who had no immunity. We have records of epidemic smallpox outbreaks that would devastate 90% of the community, or all of them in some instances. If you can recall the story, we're getting real close to Thanksgiving, you recall the story of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims. Well, when they first show up in Plymouth, they find these deserted Indian villages. They're all gone. They find some bleached bones laying about on the ground. The Indians are all gone. What's happened? Where'd they go? They're all dead because they had contracted smallpox and were wiped out. But to the Pilgrims, this was God paving the way for the city on the hill. Okay, getting it ready. So I can't underestimate, can't overemphasize the role of disease and the generational trauma that would follow something like that. Just imagine 90% of your friends and family die. You're the last 10%. What does that do to you psychologically? Okay? What about all the people who kept the knowledge? The people who were the cultural bearers, the people who were the history bearers of those people. Once they're dead, that knowledge is gone. Okay? And so that's what happened before the English first stepped foot on the sand in Jamestown. That all took place. In the 1500s, 1530s, Hernando de Soto, who was a Spanish conquistador, took a big swath, a big travel. He took a big route through the southeast, about as far north as western North Carolina, and then back down to the Gulf Coast. What De Soto and his troops left behind were epidemic disease. And those Mississippian cultures who were once thriving, that were stratified societies with priestly elites at the top and artisans in the middle and farmers at the bottom. They had this whole complex societal system. All that collapses. Okay, in part because of the introduction of disease and its effects. Okay? So are we good on disease? Disease changed everything. And that's a very important thing to consider when we think about Eastern North America in particular, because it hit here first, obviously. Okay? And then by the time European powers come over and start to colonize, the whole dynamic of Eastern America, the politics of it, it's all changed already. Those groups that were in a powerful position, perhaps they were devastated. They have to be absorbed by other groups. So the politics and the power in Eastern America, it all changes even before the first colonizations begin to occur. So when we read all these books, we read all about these first-hand accounts of people in the Ohio Valley encountering Indians, the Shawnees, the Delawares, the Mingos. Remember, all these people are survivors. These are the folks who were left and who lived through some of those epidemic disease. Okay? You had to understand that before we got any further. Let's talk a little bit more about the Ohio Valley. This will become a very important place. But I try to emphasize to my students, Eastern America is where we learned, we being European peoples, learned to interact with native peoples. It would be where we learned to interact, where we learned stereotypes about them. These are the things that we would carry out west. And I usually use a map to show people this. I have a map of the United States, and I'll put my thumb on Jamestown, okay? And then I'll put my pinky finger up on the Ohio River. And I'll say Jamestown, 1607. I'll say first substantial white settlement west of the Ohio River, first decade of the 19th century. 1810s, thereabouts, right? Okay, so, folks, that's 200 years. 200 years to go from here to here. And then I'll tell my students, what about this? I'll walk all the way over to California. I'll say, what's happening in 1849? The gold rush. 200 years. 50 years. Okay? You see my point? So we learned how to interact with, we learned our stereotypes about Native people here. Okay? And I bring that up because when a lot of people think Indians, they think West. They think plains, they think teepees, they think war bonnets, they think horses and buffalo. Okay? They think bad Hollywood movies. Typically. And so that's what I'm trying to point out to you. Okay? The rich culture and the history of interaction that we have here in the East. Let's talk about the Ohio Valley. Well, I'll tell you what, first we need to talk about stuff. You guys have heard my talk before, you know, the stuff is very important. What do I mean by the stuff? The Europeans brought lots of good stuff. They brought firearms, they brought copper kettles, they brought iron tools, knives and axes, they brought beads that were nice for decoration, they brought all these new things, and the native people loved it, okay? And they began to trade for it. What were they trading? Furs. This was the fur trade. They were taking deer skin, which was supplying leather to Europe, but most importantly, they were taking beaver skins, because beaver felt is used for beaver felt hats, that was all the rage in Europe. You had to have a beaver felt hat. Okay? That's why the beaver was called round gold. It was so very valuable. Well, the Iroquois folks, who start trading very early on in their neck of the woods up in the Northeast with the Dutch, well, they're getting firearms and they're getting all the good stuff. Well, beavers have a finite population. And once all the beavers are gone in their area, they start to push out to find new hunting and trapping areas. Unfortunately, there are people in those areas, and so they begin a war of expansion for material purposes. They push west, they push out the Erie or Neutral Indians, among others, and then they come down here. They come down here into the Ohio Valley. Who's here at that time? Okay? We're talking about the 1630s through 1680s. Okay, 1630s through 1680s. The period we know as the Beaver Wars. Well, the Shawnee are here. Okay. And the Shawnee don't have the boomsticks that the Iroquois do, that they traded with the Dutch for. And so they are at a bad technological disadvantage. And so what happens in the 1630s to 1680s is somewhat of a diaspora of the Shawnee people from the Ohio Valley. Okay? When the Shawnees get into the Ohio Valley, no one's really sure. There are different theories, different speculations. They've been there for a while by the time you got to the 1630s. They spread out and go different places. Some of them stay here, most of them spread out. Okay? So, for a long time, the Ohio Valley gets kind of quiet for a couple of generations. The Iroquois are using this area to trap, to hunt. Okay? Let's fast forward a little bit more. 1740s, the Iroquois folks aren't as much of a threat to the Ohio Valley peoples, and they start to filter back into the Ohio Valley. There was a group out west that comes back, a group in the east along the Delaware that comes back. Two groups in the south, one along the Creek, one along the Cherokee, they start coming back. One of the things that they hear where they're at is that the Delaware, the Lenape Indians, are being pushed from their lands. Now, the Lenape or the Delaware are considered the grandfathers of the Algonquian tribes in the east. And we're going to talk a little bit more about familial terms. We call people grandfather and brother and what that means. But they're considered grandfathers. They are the progenitors of the Algonquian people here in the East. So when the grandfathers, word came that the grandfathers were being pushed out of their lands, the Shawnees began to migrate back to the Ohio Valley. The Ohio Valley now begins to become a place of refugees. It becomes a place of refugees because the displaced Lenape or Delaware Indians are coming over here to live. Some really disgruntled, displaced, irritated Iroquois, mostly Senecas, some Oneidas, some Cayugas. They're coming out here too to get away. So the Ohio Valley starts to fill up with these refugees. Okay? By the way, when those Iroquois folks came out here to the Ohio Valley, what did we call them, Spence? What were their names?
Mingo.
They were the Mingos. Okay, so what we know is Mingo Indians are predominantly Senecas, the Cayugas, Oneidas, probably a few others. Okay, but out here we call them Mingo. Of course, Logan was the chief of the Mingo. He was Cayuga. Now, the Ohio Valley becomes a land of refugees, and so what would, let's fast forward a little bit further. What would one of these villages look like? If we jumped in a canoe and went down the Ohio in, say, 1770, okay? We jumped off and went to one of these villages along the Ohio, what would it look like? Well, you would have different ethnic groups living in the same village. So you could walk through that village and probably hear a couple different languages being spoken, okay? What else does it look like? Well, there was an island right below Pittsburgh called Logstown. And if you got off into that Indian village, most of the Indians there lived in log cabins, okay? Many of them had adopted the German-style log cabin, okay? So you would have a mix in this village. You would see German-style log cabins, you would see traditional bark-covered wiki walls, okay? You might see things that look like longhouses, which were bigger and could hold several families. But you would see this mix, okay? And that's what the accounts tell us. These were multi-ethnic, mixed communities, the land of refugees. Here's the thing about the people who were here in the Ohio Valley in the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s. They don't want to go. This is their homeland. That river becomes the line. They draw the line, the Ohio River. And beginning with skirmishes in the 1740s, until the death of Tecumseh in 1812, the Ohio Indians fought like hell. They fought like hell. Okay, and I say that with emphasis because Lord Dunmore's War, the American Revolution, the battles against Harper and St. Clair, and later Anthony Wayne, and then the War of 1812 when the Native people here sided with the British to fight the Americans. All along, generations knew nothing but conflict. There were generations of Shawnees and Delawares and others who knew nothing but conflict. And you think of more famous people that you've probably heard of, like Tecumseh. Tecumseh grew up knowing nothing but warfare with Europeans, in particular Virginians. Okay? Because it's the Virginians who are the number one enemy of the Ohio Valley peoples. And you see this beginning in the 1740s, and when Tecumseh is killed in 1812, he is killed by a Harrison from Virginia. So that same thing plays out over decades and decades. Okay? So they drew the line at the Ohio, they fought for it. They had the rug pulled out of them, from under them, that is the Ohio Valley peoples, by two things that happened in 1768. Two treaties. One was the Treaty of Hard Labor with the Cherokees in the South. They said, all the land up to the Kanawha River, sure, we'll sell it to you. At the same time, in New York, the Iroquois, who have always said they had control of the Ohio Valley, those are our dependents. We control them. No, not really. But they sold the land during the Treaty of Fort Stanley in 1768 and said, yeah, everything east of the Ohio River is yours. We sell it to you. So the Shawnees and the Delawares and the Mingos here in the Ohio Valley going, hey, what was that all about? We didn't see any compensation for this sale, and now these people are starting to flood into our territory. And that really begins to rise tensions. And things are getting really bad, in particular because these white Virginians are coming over and they're killing all the deer. Why is that important? Not just for food. Because the deer is what you use to buy the stuff that you like and you need. You got to have the stuff now because you're dependent. You're dependent on the stuff. You got to have it. You don't use bows and arrows anymore. You use firearms. You can't manufacture those firearms. You have to buy them. Okay? You wear, instead of buckskin clothing, you wear linen shirts. Okay? You have to buy those. You don't use clay pots anymore. You use copper pots. For the first time, I can pick it up and travel with it. I can have a meal on the road with a copper pot. Okay? You need all those things. So you have to have those deer. And once they start taking all the deer, you got problems. Okay? And you hear Ohio Valley Indians voicing this concern over and over again. These people we call long hunters. These long hunters are principally Virginians, mostly men without families. They're not looking to settle and build a homestead. They're looking to kill all the animals they can and make as much profit as they can. And so things are starting to get really, really tense out here on the Ohio. And every once in a while you have a murder here or there. You have to understand, there was no authority on the frontier at that time. 1774, the last troops are pulled, the British regulars are pulled from Fort Pitt because things are getting heated up in Massachusetts. So once they go, who's out here? Who's out here to govern? Who's out here to control? Nobody. There was a Cherokee who was murdered by a man named Crabtree. And I remember the quote. There were a lot of people who were outraged at this murder. A lot of Anglo-European people who were on the frontier outraged by the murder. But the quote I remember was, "It would be easier to find 100 to conceal him than 10 to bring him to justice." Easier to find 100 to hide him than 10 to bring him to justice. And that was the state of the frontier at that time. Well, it's all going to come to a head, okay? You know the story of Logan. You know Logan's family was killed not far from here. And that will be the precipitating event that Virginia was waiting for, because they know that in the Indian manner of justice, the mourning, what we call the mourning war, basically means an eye for an eye. You kill somebody from my family, it's my obligation to kill somebody from your family or your clan. That's how it works, okay? Well, they know that Logan's going to retaliate for the murders of his family. And when he begins to retaliate, they say, hey, it's an Indian uprising. Mount up, boys. And two armies come toward the Ohio Valley. One from Pittsburgh or Dunmore, the governor of Virginia. The other up the Kanawha River, led by Andrew Lewis. We're not quite to the 1830s. Andrew Lewis, okay? Andrew Lewis's troops get to a point where the Kanawha meets the Ohio. Very pleasant, very nice the evening they got there. That's why they dubbed it Point Pleasant, okay? Well, the wait the next morning was not so pleasant, okay? Because the night of October 10th, 1774, over 1,000 painted Indians got on rafts, silently slid across that river, and they lied in wait. And what happened the next day is still, to this day, one of the biggest, bloodiest battles to ever occur between Indians and Europeans, that being the Battle of Point Pleasant. Lasted all day long, okay, helping 1,000 people, 1,000 or so on one side, 1,000 or so on the other. So, that's one of the big blows to the Ohio Valley tribes. And I'm trying to keep this a little bit localized here, okay? The next big blow to the Ohio Valley people and to the Eastern Indian people will be the American Revolution. Here's a couple things you need to know about Indian nations and Indian people during this period, the 18th century. They often had to make a choice between two evils, okay? In the 1750s, was it the French or was it the English? These people had to make a choice. They didn't have the luxury of not making a choice or remaining neutral. Okay, well, what did the French want? First, we call it furs and faith. Furs and faith. The French wanted furs and faith. They wanted the trade. They want the economic benefit. Okay? They didn't want to colonize like the English did. Louis XIV felt that colonies were like children. You know, once you create them, you have to, they cost a lot of money. Care of them, they don't something. And so the French weren't out to colonize so much. Okay. What did the British want? Land. Everything. Okay. They wanted the land, they wanted to permanently colonize, okay? And whereas the French would take the time to break bread with Indians and learn their language and their customs to better interact with them, whereas the French would intermarry a lot with the Indians because it's easier to trade with relatives and strangers, okay? The British would not do that. Okay? The British had a different approach, okay? And so a lot of the Ohio Valley tribes during the 1750s fought with the French against the British because they were the principal threat, right? You've heard of a guy named Braddock? He had a little spot of trouble not far from here, up high. Okay. Now, here comes the American Revolution. These people are faced with the choice again, lesser of two evils. Do you fight with the British against the Americans, who are the more immediate threat, especially Virginians? Okay. Or do you side with the British and try to expel them? Well, many of them are going to side with the British, with disastrous results. We know who won the war, okay? So after the British lost, those native tribes that had sided with the British, talking about the Iroquois tribes in particular, are going to pay a heavy price. Because you sided with tyranny, what we do to you now is justifiable. So Washington sends a guy named Sullivan, General Sullivan, on a scorched earth campaign through the Northeast. A lot of the Iroquois folks are burnt out and their fields are salted. You know, once you salt fields, nothing will grow. And so the American Revolution was one of the worst things that happened to Eastern Indian peoples and Indian peoples in general. And what happens after it's over? Well, the era of aggressive expansionism begins following the American Revolution. So there was really a turning point. Things got worse after that revolution for Native peoples. Okay. Again, 1812, choice of two evils. Again, it's the British versus the Americans. Tecumseh and his followers, many Shawnee, but other tribes as well, would side with the British against the Americans, and ultimately they would lose again. What's another principal thing that happened after that? Well, then you have the removal period of the 1830s, where the Southeast tribes are removed to Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory. And we know that better as the Trail of Tears, okay? That's about where I got you to if you heard my two talks before. And I wanted to do that by way of review before we talk a little bit more about cultural things. And then I also want to talk a little bit about Indians in the present day, because I have found that when you're talking about Indians, most people think of Indians in the past. And that's why I try to hit the message in the present, so that you realize Indians are still around and they're everywhere in our society. They're all around all the time. Okay? Let's talk about some cultural things, because once again, my excess verbiage has got us close to time. Let's talk a little bit about religion. Okay? There are some things we can say generally about Indian peoples. They're all different. They have their own languages. They have their own cultures. Okay? There are some ubiquitous things we can say. When we're talking about religion, there seems to be this understanding that Indian peoples are polytheistic. That is, they worship nature and everything is a god. You know, the tree god and the river god. No, that's not the case. Most Native peoples have one creator. Okay, that's their notion of creation. One creator, but many manifestations of that creation. Everything is a manifestation of that creation. So I just wanted to mention that too. And Native people are very inclusivist when it comes to religious outcomes. You can believe anything you want to believe as long as it doesn't hurt other people. Okay? That was their outlook about religion. Okay? So I just wanted to point that out to you and dispel that the idea of polytheism, matrilineal versus patrilineal. Matrilineal societies were controlled through the women. The line of descent is traced through the women. Most Native peoples here in the East were matrilineal. The Cherokee were matrilineal. The Iroquois groups were matrilineal. And that means that everything is traced to the woman, any kind of inheritance goes through the woman, okay? Her children belong to her clan. And by the way, in a matrilineal society, who really trains her children? Does the father train the children? Their uncle does. Their mother's brother, because he's part of their clan, okay? Their father probably trains his sister's children, because he's part of their clan. And one thing you don't do, one of the taboos, is you don't marry within your own clan, okay? Some groups are patrilineal. The Shawnee, for example, were a patrilineal group, and they trace their descent through the father. And my Cherokee friends always like to make fun of me, because they say, well, you always know who the mother is. You don't always know who the father is, you always know who the mother is. That's why we're matrilineal. Okay? But let's talk about women's roles a little bit too. This is something I didn't touch on last time. Women had a very powerful place in Native society. If you think among the Iroquois people, they had what were called clan mothers. Among the Cherokee, they have beloved women. Okay? These were women who could start wars. They could call for the beginning of a war. When captives were brought in, these women could decide if they lived or if they died. When it came to political appointments, you think of the clan mothers among the Iroquois. The clan mothers choose a child when he's young. He's particularly adept at certain skills. They think he's going to be a good leader. They pick him young and they train him. They train him to become a leader. When it's time, they put him in place. If they don't do what the women want, the women can take you out. They can depose you. And I once had a colleague of mine, we got into this discussion, he said, well, there's a difference between influence and power. I said, okay. You can start a war. You decide life or death. You control all the government appointments. That's a little bit more an influence. Okay? And when it came to, in matrilineal society in particular, when it came to rights to property or a certain field or area, that was the woman's. And if you wanted a divorce from your husband, it simply consisted of you taking the stuff and sending it outside. He comes home, stuff's outside, probably he knows it's time to go back to his mom. Okay? So women had a lot of power. And one of the things you see in all these negotiations that took place with European powers, okay? They would come to these big councils with European powers, and they would say, where are your women? The Europeans said, well, our women don't participate in these types of things, because when the Native people showed up, they brought not only their women, they brought their families. They all came together, okay? They would say, where are your women? Well, their women didn't have a voice like their women did, okay? When you read a lot of accounts of, when I say Native people are inclusivist, and when I talk about what did these villages look like in the Ohio Valley, they took in people. They took in runaway slaves. Okay, they took in captured whites. Okay, but here's an interesting phenomenon that occurred. Okay, you see that when these people come to be redeemed, if you think of 1764, when Colonel Bouquet defeats the Indians at Bushy Run. Well, part of the stipulation is that they bring back all the captured whites, okay, and give them back to the British. They had to drag them kicking and screaming. And in some instances, these people would get away and run back to the Indians, okay? But when you see the other side of that, when you see Indians that were brought to live among Europeans, they didn't want to stay. Most often they wanted to leave, okay? But women in particular, who were taken from European societies and adopted into Native societies with all the privileges that women had, they would much prefer to stay in that situation because they have a voice, they have power. There was one account of a slave ran away from the Valley of Virginia, and she made it into the Kanawha Valley somehow. She's found by a Shawnee man. She's brought back. She later marries this man. She has children with this man. Okay. There's some treaty negotiations following where Dunmore was born in 1775. They said, you have to give us back all our white folks and all our Negroes that we know are among you. And the Indians come back and they say, look, we told them to leave, they won't go. Okay. This one woman, they end up sending her back. She decides, she leaves her children, okay? If someone didn't go, they were going to come and try to take everybody. But this is a great story. This woman decides, this runaway slave who had been given status now in a native society, okay, is taken away. She's placed back into slavery. She has to leave her children, she has to leave that status in that society. She's put back in, and she's enslaved again. So again, an example of the power of women in native societies, the role of native society. Okay. Generally speaking, when we talk about the gender division of labor, men's roles had to do with killing stuff, and women's roles had to do with bringing it to life. What do I mean by that? Well, native people were very agricultural here in the East. They didn't chase the buffalo. They didn't have pop-up tents, otherwise known as teepees, okay, in order to chase the buffalo. They were more sedentary and they were more agricultural. You think corn, beans, squash, among others, okay? And so the men had to go out and clear the fields. So they had to kill trees. They had to slash and burn. And Indians did practice slash and burn agriculture. So they're killing the forest. But the women come, they plant, they harvest, they tend the crops, which bring life. Men go out and they kill the animals. They bring it back, the women cook them to give life. Men defend against enemy, they kill enemies. Women give birth, they give life. So the roles are kind of set on that dichotomy. I'm trying to hurry. The clans were very specialized. When we think about the social structure of Indian tribes, clans were very specialized. Each clan had a specific responsibility. There was a clan who were the herbalists. They were the medicinal people. And the people in their clan were always trained to supply medical people, for lack of a better term. People who were herbalists. There were clans who were tasked with producing the civil chief. There were clans that were tasked with producing the war chief, the war leader. Which brings me to a very important point. Most native peoples in the East had a dual form of government. There was a red government and a white government. The white government was the civil authority. These were mostly hereditary chiefs, and they ruled in times of peace. In times of declared war, a whole other set of leadership takes over. You have a war chief and all his counselors, and they take over the government during a time of declared war. Be careful. What is a time of declared war? I'm going to talk about me and Spencer and 12 other guys going out and raiding the settlement and coming back with some of the stuff, some horses and things like that. That's not warfare. That's us going out and being kids and doing what young warriors did. When I'm talking about declared warfare, that's the whole nation coming together and saying, we are going to openly fight these other people as a nation, as a group of people. In times of declared war like that, the war chief and his administration, they take over. So there's a dual form of government. Hereditary chiefs become civil leaders. To become a war leader, you have to earn it. War chiefs are based on merit. You have to earn the spot as a war chief. Let's talk about warfare for a minute, okay? Because that's a great big stereotype when it comes to Native people. Native people did not necessarily love warfare. They weren't bloodthirsty, okay? Warfare was a very serious matter. Now, if you're a young man, if you're 14, 15, 16, and you want to distinguish yourself, you and a bunch of other 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, you get together and you go raid your neighbors, and you get into some fights. One or two people might die, okay, as a result. But that was about it. Open warfare is something completely different. The deliberations would go on. The women would have to weigh in and give their voice on whether or not to fight. And when it came down to open warfare, all these deliberations, all these things had already been gone through. This was a serious matter. Native people didn't like necessarily to go out and kill people. They did it when they had to. And when you look at the history of Eastern America, usually if there's an Indian attack almost always there's a precipitating event. It's not just because they want to get up one morning and go kill some white folks, okay? Usually there's something that triggers it. It's usually a retaliation. So make sure you look closely at those. The other thing, let's talk about the paint. I mean, a lot of people, they see these reenactments of it, at OB for Fort Henry Days, they see the paint. Principally, they see the black and the red. Let's talk about that paint. What does that paint mean? Well, Native people painted for different reasons all the time. They would use bear grease and ochre, which is a red pigment, and they would cover their body. They weren't actually red, but they became known as red men from their use of ochre that they mixed with their bear grease. The bear grease did a couple things. It acted as a skin protectant. It would soften the skin. It would also act as an insect repellent, keep mosquitoes and things away. But when you painted for war, black and red, principally, that was a different circumstance. For Shawnee people in particular, you went for 4 days of ritual preparation. You decided that we're going to undertake this war. For 4 days, the warriors will leave their families, leave their children. They go out and they ritually prepare themselves. The last part of that 4-day preparation is you put on that paint, because when you put on that paint, you become the other. You become the demon. Because you have to go out and you have to do nasty things that you have to do. Okay? But then before you come back, before you go back to your children and your family in the village, you go to water. You go to water and you wash that paint off. Because you're taking away the other and the demon, and you're washing him away. And then you're going to go back to your family and your children and try to have some kind of normalcy. Don't think the Native people didn't suffer from PTSD, okay, because they did. You have children, and you may have had to do nasty things. And so you wash that away before you cleanse yourself before you can go back. So that's a little bit about the paint, what the paint's all about. I've got like 20 other things on my notepad. We've got like 5 minutes. Here's what I'm going to do for the next 5 minutes, and then I want to show you a quick video. I need to end this message in the present. This is the third talk I've done in Wheeling on Indians, and I've yet to end the message in the present. Okay? All right. Indians today are still around. Okay? As a matter of fact, there are 556 federally recognized tribes. If you go slightly to the east to our friends in Virginia, the state of Virginia has now 10 state recognized tribes. If you go across the river into Ohio, Ohio has 1 state recognized tribe, the United Remnant Band Shawnee. So Native people are still here. They're all around us. What does it mean, though, to be federally recognized, to be state recognized? Well, federal recognition means that you have a government-to-government, your people have a government-to-government relationship with the United States, with all that it implies, which means you're eligible for health care and education benefits and things like that. If you are a state-recognized tribal group, all that is the state legislature saying, hey, we see you, we recognize that you're here, and you have a history here. That's it. It does not confer to you any benefits of any sort, although it is quite respectful to finally recognize people like that. 10 in Virginia, 1 in Ohio, 0 in West Virginia. 556 federal tribes. Indians are still around. There is a renaissance going on in Indian country, and it has been going on for about 30 or 40 years. Back during the 70s, 60s and 70s is when this whole thing started to take off. Because you had the social movements of the 60s and 70s. Along with the Black Power movement, you also had the Red Power movement. Okay? You had hippies who wanted to be Indians. Okay? You had more people paying attention to Indians more than ever. If you recall 1973, has anybody here, and this always amazes me that people generally don't know about this, in 1973, There was a 3-month standoff between the Lakota people and the FBI. Okay? It was a place called Wounded Knee. In 1973, Wounded Knee was retaken by the Lakota, and they held it and fought against the FBI for 3 months. Tanks and guns and everything else. And a couple people died on either side. But at that point, it was one of the largest internal insurrections since the Civil War. That and the West Virginia Mine Wars occupied places, the two largest insurrections. Most people don't know about that. But Indians shocked themselves back into the national consciousness because people started to see it on TV. What do you mean 3 months standoff? Indians are still here? And people started to realize, hey, they're still around. But what happened during the 70s was what we call the era of the new social history. Instead of white, wealthy men, people were starting to look at Indians, minorities, women, lower class people as a field of study. Believe it or not, until the 70s, people didn't really study about that stuff so much. Okay? But you see this wave starting in the 70s. More Indian programs are now in universities. More Indians are participating in museums and historic sites. More historic sites are taking on the stories that they haven't told before when it concerns Indians. You have more Indian professionals now than ever before. There are more Indians in graduate school now than ever before in history. In the decade of the 1990s, Native people were the fastest growing minority population per capita in the country. If you look at it large scale, Hispanics were, but per capita, Native people were the largest growing minority group in the 1990s. So what I'm trying to tell you is, things are changing in Indian country. There is efforts underway now for language revitalization, for cultural revitalization. You know, if you go down to the Eastern Range, Cherokee, North Carolina, those kids learn Cherokee language starting in preschool until they graduate high school. They have Cherokee language every year, okay? And there's a lot more we can talk about, but I need to show you a video very quickly. Is it okay, Sean? A few things you're going to see in this video. Material culture. Look at what the Indians are wearing. These are Eastern Range Cherokees in a program at Colonial Williamsburg. Look at what they're wearing. When the delegation comes to the Capitol building in this video, look who leads them. There's a woman wearing a feathered cape. Her name is Marie Jumaluska. She is a beloved woman among the Cherokee. So the women lead the delegation. Listen to the language that is used. You're going to hear Cherokee language. The person who is speaking it for the delegation is the language teacher down in Cherokee, one of the language teachers. So language revitalization becomes a part of this program. Think about the diplomacy, the terminology that's used in the video. You're going to hear brother a lot. Brother, brother. These familial terms were always used in diplomacy to gain familiarity with one another. But here's the thing, if I call you brother, then that assumes a pretty level playing field. The French insisted that the Indians call him father, and that suggests a different power relationship. So listen to the terminology, okay? And the wampum belt that you're going to see is an important part of diplomacy. Wampum was a shell bead made from cowhide clam shells and the whelk shell. These were made into belts that had representations of different things. So wampum is also part of the diplomacy here. And we'll take questions after the video, so stick around. A little bit.
You're still in the way.
Touch again over fast. the Capitol building on Colonial Williamsburg.
I think he's gonna have to wait till the country club or something.
Beloved woman in front, Walker Calhoun, one of their elders. Notice their dress, European shirt. They got wool leggings, a lot of them. These are all Eastern Band charities. The Governor's Council is on the left. The Governor's Council of Virginia. This is 1755.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Fall 1755, a troubling and dangerous time for the colony of Virginia. For the past few years, the French and the English have been jockeying for position to see who will control North America. This past summer of 1755, hot cricket and open conflict began. The French had opened a fort in the Ohio Valley. The English sent an army made up of British soldiers and Virginia soldiers, among other colonies, to push the French out. That army was led by Major General Andrew Braddock. It made its way toward the French fort at the coast of the Ohio, and there, that army was destroyed by the French, by their Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, and other native allies.
See the clothing.
The frontiers of Virginia lay wide open. War parties devastated the frontier. Many have fled to the safety of the eastern cities. While the French and the English jockey to see who will control the territory, it is not they, but the native people of this land that hold the balance of power. In the South, the Cherokee people are considered the major military force. The French and the English will both employ diplomacy to gain their alliance. And so this delegation has come here to Virginia, to the capital city, to see what Virginia delegates have to say. They have crossed mountains, rivers, peatmonts, and coastal plains to come here. With them, they carry a most important artifact of diplomacy, a waffle bell made of small purple and white shell beads. Governor Abraham Smith, I'm a further own Cherokee. I was served as a servant on this case.
Notice the wampum belt.
It's sent here by my father and the other chiefs of the Cherokee.
These were the same words that were used in 1755. Same words.
We had 10 warriors ready to come last summer before our attack by the Northern Indians could not come. You were very troubled when coming here from the mountain. Many Virginians had deserted their homes, and many were killed by the Northern Indians. The Shawnee and the other Northern Indians are down the farm for our nations as well.
He just said the Tecumseh was a Cherokee. That's what he just said. He's messing with me.
You will have to fight against the Shawnee and the other Northern Indians for the injury they have done to us, your brother. Our brothers fight very strong, but cannot solve the Indian life as we can. We can go there and set a nice little word.
He said, I forgot what I'm supposed to be saying.
are thankful for our lives, for us, our efforts to love. We ask that you use this interpreter who's in ministry among us. He is our longest. Believe he will not go alive.
In naval diplomacy, nothing is final until wampum is exchanged. In 250 years, we were off by 3 days from the tech movement. That belt, if you visit Colonial Williamsburg, that wampum belt is now on permanent display in the Governor's Council chamber on the second floor of the building. It's always going to be there. This is a delegation of Cherokee who brought the belt. He used the same words 250 years that were used 250 years earlier. They brought that belt back to the building. The belt is now riveted in the building permanently.
The Cherokee would hold true to their promise to help the Virginians. The next year, 1756, they would send 140 of their warriors to go with Virginia troops on a punitive expedition against the Shawnee and the Virginians that most of them are. This is not the only time that they had visited the capital city. In a 25-year period, 1777, Virginia was in the middle of the American Revolution. That delegation then fulfilled their African heritage at the palace. After that meeting, they came out to the palace green where they danced with the people of this town. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock on the palace green, we will recreate this historic town.
Okay. So again, some of the things that I was talking about today play themselves out in the little scene you saw there. What are your questions? Yes, sir.
You talked about the red and white
Government.
structures.
Mhm.
Was there any instance where one person represented both the red and the white?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. Spence, you ever heard of it? Other questions?
Could you capsulize briefly
Briefly.
the chronological order? Yeah, briefly is in there. Chronological order of the tribes and the periods of time in which they lived in our immediate area.
Oh dear Lord, sir. Can we talk after? Can we talk after? Because that takes a little bit longer than I think we have time for.
All right.
I mean, there are the native peoples who were living here in the Ohio Valley that we call Adena and Hopewell. We don't know who they were, what they called themselves. We do know that they were different ethnic groups because the only thing they really shared in common was this mound building trait that was shared. They may have spoke different languages, different culturally. Then later on, we have what we call Fort Ancient people, okay? And then we have the Monongahela people in this region. We don't know exactly who these people are either. They may have been Massawomics, when we're talking about the Monongahelians. We don't know, really. The first historic tribe on record as having been in the Ohio Valley comes from the French. The French are doing the first explorations of the Ohio Valley, and they encounter Shawnees. They call them Shawans or something like that. So it'd be the Shawnees, the first historic tribe that we know and we can place historically in the Ohio Valley. And that's in the 1600s, 17th century. Yes, sir.
When was the last time any inhabitants were here?
I'd say they're probably still here.
No, I mean like a village.
Like a village?
Yeah.
I do know that, I don't know. I don't know the exact answer to that. I do know that in 1774, there was a village still in Moundsville during the Dunmore's War, and those folks got chased out in 1774. So that puts Native people in villages along this river in vicinity right before the Revolution. If you think of Fort Henry and all that, they weren't living here much earlier. I mean, it wasn't too far back. They were living around. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Could you comment a bit about the Harvest Festival, what's the logo?
You talking about green corn ceremony?
I'm talking about any of the harvest, green harvest.
You mean local festivals going on?
I'm talking about way back.
Way back?
Nothing, pre-Thanksgiving.
There were always communal ceremonies that attended the planting of crops, communal ceremonies that attended the reaping of the crops, or the harvesting of the crops. But those varied from group to group. Among the southeast peoples, the biggest one was the green corn ceremony, which was held in the late summer, and that was their biggest ceremony of the year. So the ceremony of giving thanks for the harvest, but also a ceremony of renewal, just kind of like the native New Year. It's kind of like their renewal in the beginning of their new year. And the people would take pieces of the fire from the central fire. They would extinguish all their fires in their homes, and then they would go to the central council spot, and they would take a piece of that fire, and everyone would take a piece of that fire back and relight their fires for the new year from the central fire. That's part of the green corn as well. They still do the green corn ceremony. The Cherokee still hold a green corn ceremony. They still stomp dance. I mean, Native people are still here. They're still practicing their traditions. They're still around. Yes.
But I guess, I don't know if it was a presumption or a supposition, apparently incorrect on my part, that when the women who had been kidnapped by the Indians had that opportunity to return and would return to the white men, it was because of shame, that they would be shamed because they've been living with savages.
Most of them wanted to stay.
They wanted to be.
What I've read, I mean, there's a lot of captivity here that's out there. Some of them are really nasty. but from what I read, most of them prefer to stay. And another thing that I found that is quite interesting, Spence, you tell me if you've ever read this either. In all these captivity narratives, when these women are captive, I never once read of them being misused. They're not raped, they're not beat up, okay? Because here's the thing, these people have lost tribal members through disease, warfare. They're looking to replace them. And so it was more prestigious for you to bring back a captive than a scalp, because that captive can become part of your community. And oftentimes these captive people would actually take on the name of a deceased relative, and they'd be placed with their family so that they could take over the roles that that deceased person had previously filled. Yes?
We bought this house that's been built in the 1840s, and it has wooden shutters on it that go up and down just like windows.
Yeah.
Have their own weight system, all of that. And we don't know why they're there, and anytime we talk to anybody, they say, oh, the Indians were long gone. But these windows face the river.
Yeah.
And do you have any insights, or any of the rest of you?
It was built in the 1840s. The last Indian killed in what is now the state of West Virginia was in 1796. Okay. And so by the 1840s, hostilities have been over for 50 years.
Air conditioning.
Air conditioning. Other questions right now? Yes, ma'am.
Culturally, are the Indians monogamous people?
Well, it depends. It depends on which group you're talking about. Some of them practice polygamy. A man can have several wives. Don't know of wives having several husbands. That's something that's not typical. But, I mean, relationships were kind of fluid. Most people made it for life. But relationships are really fluid. I mean, young people were encouraged to go out and experiment. I mean, that's something that they were supposed to do. Then, once you've kind of sown your wild oats when you're a young person, you find that one person you're going to raise a family with, and that's typically who you stay with. But when I say they're very fluid, I mean, marriage is an understood thing. People in the community understand that you two are together. But if you want to split up, that's no big deal either. It's not like a big divorce process with lawyers and things. You're done. I mean, that's it. You just go away. Yes. Yes.
And this may be available, send with email. What books or articles do you recommend that?
I brought you all a suggested reading list, okay, and it has about 10 good beginning books. I call this a good start. Okay, and some of these up here, I'll put out here on the table for you to look at as well. So come up and get your suggested reading. Hey, other questions? Hey, if you want to learn out about Indian studies, there are more people now who are writing about it. There are more people now who are studying it than ever before. As one of my professors put it, it's academically hot. So, and there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot. But here's a couple things I'll point out to you. If you want to get to, see, I'm trained as an historian, so what we go for are the primary sources, the stuff that people wrote when they saw it, when they lived during that time. And there's a couple in particular. Two guys who are missionaries, one a Moravian missionary, John Heckwelder. Heckwelder lived among the Indians in this region, and he wrote about their manners, customs, and history. Okay. And the other was David Zeisberg, also a missionary who lived among the Indians. These are what I consider primary sources. These are people who lived with them during the time period and recorded what they saw. So this is good stuff. There are a lot of secondary sources up here as well. When you're thinking about West Virginia, does everybody know the Big Four? We call them the Big Four in West Virginia frontier history. There's Doddridge's Notes on the Settlement and Indian Wars. There is Wills the Hass, his History of the Settlement and Indian Wars of West Virginia. There is, McWhorter, who is Border Settlers of Northwestern Virginia. And then there is Chronicles of World Warfare. Withers, Alexander Scott Withers, Chronicles of World Warfare. Those four deal, those are 19th, they were written in the 19th century that deal specifically with the history of this region. I don't have them on your list, so they're a little bit more detailed. Yes.
Other than Meadowcroft, are there any active archaeology things going on in this area since there was so much?
In this area, not right now that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. We just had the Marmet Long Dam project, which had been ongoing in all over the valley. They found a lot of stuff with that, very important stuff, which is now going to be going to Great Creek down Mound Building, which is going to be curated now. But as far as ongoing archaeology in this region right now, I don't know. Andrea, do you know of any ongoing archaeology in this region right now?
I wouldn't know any specifics, but
Not
there's
some.
probably, permit-related work goes on all the time.
Yeah. We have found things in the Ohio Valley that date back 10,000 years. Okay. People have been here for a long time. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, they're putting the dating back 16,000 years. Yeah. Okay, that's one of the oldest sites around.
Well, you said it's like one of the most interesting areas, in the world, and I thought it'd be nice if it was a little more.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, here's the thing. When Native people tell you, we have always been here. If I go down to East Ranch, Cherokee, North Carolina, they have their Katua, their mother town, which thankfully the tribe just brought a lot back from private hands. Katua is a site that was their principal town 11,000 years ago. Okay? And it was used up until the American Revolution. So 11,000 years up until the American Revolution, this was an occupied site by the Cherokee. Now, if you've been there in that place for 11,000 years, who am I to tell you you haven't always been there? I'm not going to tell you. That's 11,000 years of continuous occupation. You've always been there as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
Oh, I guess in terms of archaeology going on, we are having the West Virginia Archaeological Society's annual meeting next Saturday.
This Saturday.
They usually,
This coming Saturday.
this coming Saturday.
Yes.
And they usually that's where the professionals come and give reports on a lot of their newest research.
Pre-registration starts at 8 o'clock. Great Creek Town, Saturday. West Virginia Archaeological Society. You can pay the order. Anybody else have questions? Look, I mean, there is so much. I mean, for me to even conceive of trying to convey this to you in an hour's time, it's hard to do. I mean, I've cut out sections of what I was going to talk about, but we'll talk again. So, Ski, thank you.
Dick here to tell you about our happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books has cooks and hooks and hacks and cracks and yarns and sings, rocks and songs and more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. Make you feel like yodeling. Hey, yodie, 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 yodie. Hey, yodie, yodie, take away. Mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch. We'll provide the pot. And it's all free. Lunch with books. Knowledge is served.